So welcome everyone. We're going to get started. We have a great series we're kicking off here today. Hopefully you're able to see my screen here. The Chicago Booth Alumni Club of Chicago, with some partners across the school, are launching what we're calling the resiliency series, Forging Forward. So resiliency really being defined as the ability to overcome difficult situations, difficult occurrences, and I think we've all gone through our own unique difficulties over the past year and new challenges. So as I said, I'm Nicole Yelsey, the co-president of the Chicago Club of Chicago, Alumni Club of Chicago. We're also in partnership with the DC chapter on this, as well as the Rustandy Center for Social Innovation, as well as the Chicago Booth Women's Network, the Alumni Association, really highlighting Booth women, and then the Booth Alumni Nonprofit Consultants. The first session we're here for today is with Elena, talking about building resilient teams. We'll go into kicking that off very shortly. Upcoming, I wanted to highlight on March 4th, we'll have the second piece with Chris Bordoni, really tactics for multiplying your resiliency in 2021, really a workshop format, coming away with some really tangible action items. And then the third piece with Maria Kim, she's the president and CEO of CARA Chicago. That's going to be a unique one as well, a documentary screening that was done with CARA of Chicago, tracking the journey of 5 Chicagoans from poverty to stable employment. It'll be a documentary screening and then a conversation with Maria and the filmmakers. So mark your calendars for those. And then just wanted to highlight a couple other upcoming programs that are happening across these various clubs across the school. Innovating for Social Equity is a series that Rustandy Center has been putting on, and they have their session coming up, The Responsibility of the Business Community, on February 16th, as well as several social events that are upcoming, a coffee and conversations, alumni mixers with some of our peer schools, a pub style trivia night, and then a whiskey tasting for St. Patrick's Day. And then Chicago Booth Angels Network is going to be kicking off with their virtual pitch event on April 7th for their second year in the making. And you can find all of these events at chicagoboothalumniclub.org or on our social channels. So with that, I'm going to pass it over. Gail Luxenberg is a member of the Alumni Board of Chicago. She has spent her career leading various nonprofits and is currently executive search, matching executives in nonprofits specifically. She's going to be moderating the conversation, and I'll pass it over to her and Elena.
Thanks, Nicole. Nice to see everybody here. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, Elena, and I'm just going to say a few words of introduction before we get going. I'm your host today, and this is the next in a series that we have put on, sponsored by the Chicago Booth Alumni Club, on your work and your life, especially under pandemic. I've been a nonprofit leader throughout my career. I've managed teams from 4 people to over 1,000 people, now helping organizations find their next leaders. My University of Chicago education gave me a framework for viewing the world, and my booth education really gave me a rewarding and successful career. And so we wanted to share some of those lessons with others. I returned to Chicago about 1.5 years ago, after leading organizations in both Seattle and Atlanta, where I was a member of the alumni clubs in both cities, and found that a great place to anchor my life as I went to a new city. So just wanted to mention that the Atlanta Club is also our partner in this conversation today. In fact, they introduced us to Alana. So here we are. It's an unusual time, the pandemic, and I think that it's been an opportunity to reflect and grow. It's blurred the lines between work and home. And some of the reflections and lessons learned hopefully will be ones that will last forever. We've thought about our careers, politics, diversity and inclusion, and those topics have been reflected in the series that we put on. So we did a Zoomcast with on diversity, one on finding meaning in your career, one on preparing for board service, and then we did one with Fritz Kagi on equity and tax assessment. All those are on the Booth YouTube network channel, and if you can't find them, they're also on my LinkedIn page. So thank you also to the university for collecting all the data on the people who are joining us today. Know that a majority of you are Booth alum, some students, some just affiliated with the university, and some not, and we want to welcome all. Also want to thank Nicole and Caroline from the university, and Calvin Trung at the Alumni Club in Atlanta. I want you to know that you can ask questions as we go forward by typing them into the chat or raising your hands, and we will have an interactive session. So without further ado, let me introduce Elena Aguilar. Elena is coming to us from California, where it is not 17 degrees. She's the president and founder of Bright Morning Consulting, where she creates and leads and facilitates learning experiences for adults looking to transform themselves and their teams. Her work focuses on equity and emotional intelligence. She's the author of 6 books with Jossie Bass, the latest called Onward. She's a blogger with Edutopia. She's 20 years experience as an educator, and she has an MA in education and anthropology from UC Berkeley. Welcome, Elena.
Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you today, and I'm excited about this conversation about how we can build our individual and collective resilience.
Great. So let me ask you the first question. This has been almost a year. We're all at the end of our ropes. It's enough already. I think that before we jump into the topic of building teams, and we've talked about this plenty, but it's sort of like what they tell you on the airplane. You need to take care of yourself before you can take care of those around you. Is that a theme that is consistent with your learnings?
That is absolutely true. It's never been more true. And I think as we look at the last year, we can also recognize that there's been different phases of it. And there's been different phases, therefore, that correlate with our emotions and the way that the organizations and companies and teams that we work in have dealt. I think in the beginning, there was sort of the phase of shock and fear and what does this mean? And then maybe we settled into some routines. And now people are exhausted for what I think are some interesting reasons, one of which is because we're nearing or we're at the year mark, but also the sort of anxiety around the vaccine and when will we get it and will it work and the new strains is bringing up this whole additional level of sort of new anxiety layered onto exhaustion. We're done, we're ready to go back to normal, and real uncertainty. So it's more than ever perhaps important for us to really understand what resilience is and how we build it and how we have to start with ourselves.
So what is resiliency? Almost seems like an overused term right now. What does it really mean to you?
So for my book Onward, I did a lot of research into the definitions of resilience, both in psychology, social science, but also in the world of science and how resilience is defined. For example, when geophysicists look at earthquakes and how plate tectonics work, they also talk about resilience. And so the definition that I use that draws from all this research and echoes a great majority of it is that resilience is how we respond to adversity, but particularly it's how we respond to adversity in a way that allows us to thrive and not just survive. So resilience is not just how we muscle through something. It's not just how we scrape ourselves up after we've fallen and keep going. Resilience is actually a sort of resource or an energy or an ability that we have to bounce back stronger than we were before. And so that only happens if we're very intentional in how we deal with challenges and adversity so that we end up, again, being stronger than we were before. Not worn down, not depleted, not saying, well, we survived, but we actually want to say, we got through that incredibly difficult challenge, whether that was a pandemic or a personal challenge. And it was really hard. And I feel like I learned something. I feel more connected perhaps to myself or to others. I feel like I know how to take care of myself in a different way. And I don't want to go through anything like that again, but I actually feel stronger than before. That's what resilience is.
So now the critical question, how do you take that to a team? How do you take that to somebody else?
The first thing that we need to understand is what are the behaviors or the actions that create resilience in someone, and what are the related dispositions or psychological orientations. So we need to understand individually, and then we need to look at a team or a group and consider the applications for a collective. And so in my book Onward, I identified 12 habits that people can cultivate, that we can engage in to build our resilience. And in truth, there's probably a couple dozen things that we can do every day to boost our resilience. Some of those are connected to the way that we think, because ultimately the way that we think results in or is deeply connected with the way that we feel. And our resilience is all about our emotions, which is part of what we need to do to build resilience, is to understand our emotions and to engage with them. And then again, then we sort of pivot and we look at the teams that we're in and think, so how do we apply this here? So I'll give you an example. A resilient person is aware of their emotions, recognizes them, knows how to name them, and knows how to engage with them. And through that understanding in that process, we learn that our emotions, we're so afraid of our emotions. They feel like they take us over, like they get in the way, they stop us from doing what we want to be doing. A resilient person learns that actually we can engage with our emotions in a way that helps us be stronger, be more resilient, have more clear thinking, be more intentional about the actions we take. Now, when we turn to a team, we think, what does this understanding of emotional intelligence mean in a team? The research on a team's emotional resilience is fascinating, because you can have, this is what the research says, you can have a group of people who individually have very high emotional intelligence, very high resilience, but when they come together as a group, they don't necessarily reflect that. In other words, individuals in a group can still have a lot of dysfunctional team dynamics, can have a lot of conflict, a lot of misunderstanding, and really just not be optimizing the strength that they're bringing. A very simple strategy for cultivating group resilience, it's so simple, it sounds almost too easy to be true, but it's not, is to create opportunities for people to share with each other how they are feeling. As I say, it sounds so simple, but it's so powerful. And this doesn't mean that a group needs to engage in a therapy session or a long discussion of those feelings. It's as simple as opening up a meeting and saying to people, what kind of weather pattern reflects how you are feeling today?
Hey, how's it going?
Hi, Winnie.
Hey.
Hi, Jen. Hi. Oh, look at how cute you are. Oh my God, you just look like you.
Thank you.
So inviting people to say, do you feel today like a tornado? Do you feel like a thunder and lightning storm? Do you feel like light breeze in the air or a sunny day? Just inviting people to name. And again, it can be quick. It can be a sort of symbolic or metaphorical activity that invites them to name how they are feeling, allows and messages the acceptance of emotions, allows for emotions to show up. And when folks in a team start hearing, oh, that's how that person is feeling, that's how that one is doing, it actually raises their collective emotional intelligence. And this is based on research that was done I'm forgetting the authors' names, but they publish in the Harvard Business Review quite a bit about a team's emotional intelligence. That is, again, so we have to learn about our individual intelligence, and then we think about how do we use this with a team.
So Ilana, I know from having managed teams in different parts of the country and in different industries that sometimes the culture is not open for that, or there might not be an honesty. How do you, especially as booth people here, how do we really measure if we're hearing what is actual? How do we measure if people are being open and telling their honest selves and they're being authentic?
That's a great question, and it makes me think about what is the role of a leader. And the role of a leader, in part, is to create culture. And I think about Peter Drucker's brilliant words that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so if the role of a leader is to create culture, and part of the culture that the leader commits to creating is one in which we can bring who we are as human beings, and we can say, today I feel like a tornado. I had a crazy weekend at home taking care of the kids and trying to make this work and that work, and I'm just feeling swirling today. So if that's a leader's role, is to create culture, then in the beginning, people may not feel comfortable. They may not be honest. And a leader stays committed to their vision, to the purpose, to the goal, which might be, in this space, we're going to start creating little pockets where we can bring more of who we are, because it will build our resilience collectively. Because as we understand each other more, as we see what people are coming in with, it'll make our communication more potentially easier, smoother, when we don't, for example, take something that someone else says as personally, because we've heard that they had a chaotic weekend and they're coming in feeling like a tornado. And so in the beginning, a leader may need to message the purpose and say something like what I just said. We're going to take 5 minutes in the beginning of each meeting to bring ourselves here, to share how we are feeling, and then we're going on to the rest of our agenda. And the purpose for doing that is, and understand that people it's very likely, it's very normal to be somewhat reticent in the beginning if this is a new structure that people are engaging with. So I would say, keep going. The leader needs to model a little bit of vulnerability as well, and needs to say, this feels uncomfortable for me to do also. I'm not used to talking about how I feel at work. This is awkward. And I understand that this will make our team more effective, it'll allow us to meet our goals.
Great. So I want to share a question from one of our audience. Brett Lendorf asked, in the age of social media, some leadership has taken the form of a popularity contest. To what degree has posturing and virtue signaling overtaken character as a primary driver of leadership in today's business climate?
I think that's a great question, and one to perhaps deeply unpack. And I'll just offer a thought as it relates to cultivating resilience, which is that I think that the questions to ask are, what is the impact for leaders of taking on that kind of persona or that role? Does it ultimately allow them to meet the goals that they have set, to create the kind of companies that they want to create? Does it build their resilience? Now, to accomplish all of those big goals and long-term plans, we need the kind of energy that helps us become stronger after every time we stumble and fall down, because we will do that a lot. I know that as a CEO, last year, I thought I was not going to be able to get back up again. And then I said, wait a minute, you know something about resilience, Elena. So what do you know? How do you get back up? And how do you come out stronger than you were before? And I'll tell you, where I am right now as the CEO of my company is so much stronger than where we were a year ago, immeasurably stronger. And so there will always, I think, be perhaps distractions or temptations, whether that's social media and the way that leaders sometimes think they need to show up on social media, those kinds of distractions will always come along. If we are really committed to creating the kinds of companies that we envision to our goals, then we need to stay focused on what helps us get through all the noise and the distraction, the stumbling.
What do you do when you have a difficult team member?
That's a great question. That is the ultimate question. It's the question I get most often when I do consulting and coaching with organizations. I think the first thing that a leader needs to do is understand why it is that they are finding that team member difficult. First, we need to unpack what is it that's hard about this person, about working with them. How do other people perceive them? Is this my experience? Is it other people's as well? And then there are different pathways that we can take depending on what the relationship is with that person, what the long-term goals are, what the vision is. One of the most obvious, and again, perhaps simple things to do, is to sit down and have a conversation with them to better understand what's going on, and to sit down first and have a conversation in which you as the leader or as the team leader are trying to understand what's going on with the other person, trying to listen to them, trying to understand their perspective, their opinion of the situation. What you'll be doing through that conversation, if you are truly trying to understand them, is actually building relationship with them. And that is a prerequisite to having an impact on how someone shows up or participates in a team. They will listen to you if you have a relationship with them, if they trust you, if they respect you, if they think that ultimately you are offering feedback or providing guidance because you see their potential and you see what they could become if only they would stop interrupting so much in conversations or stop shooting down other people's ideas. And so they need to feel like you care about them, most simplistically said.
You know, we had a question about the social media world, but we're also living in a two-dimensional world right now as managers. How much more difficult is it to build a resilient team, to have authentic relationships when the world is flattened and you only see people on your Zoom screen?
I think interesting question. And I wonder if there has been an overemphasis on the downside and the negative to being on screens all the time. I think there are lots of drawbacks, and there are some positive things in the sense that I have found people to be able to have some very hard conversations on Zoom, because when you are on Zoom, even though you're just seeing each other this way, you are at home or you're in your office, but there's a way in which sometimes some people actually feel more comfortable and safer because they're in their space. And as soon as this conversation is over, they hit the red end meeting button and they are sort of back in their safety zone where they can collect themselves again. They don't have to stand up and leave your office and walk through the hallways and try to gather themselves after maybe they're feeling some strong emotions. So I've actually seen people having some powerful, hard conversations on Zoom because ironically, they feel more comfortable. Now, I'm just saying, I think that we have perhaps leaned towards the how much we've lost by being on Zoom, and we have, and not paid enough attention to the possibilities, and particularly for looking more specifically even at what kinds of people have in some ways thrived on Zoom. Are those people who are more introverted? Are they people who have who used to commute for 3 hours a day, and now they just have this additional, literally, energy, physical energy, because they're not sitting in traffic or trying to cross town. So I think there's more for us to explore and unpack about the losses and the advantages of being virtually engaging with each other.
That's a great segue to a question that Ken Volpert's asking about, you mentioned the vulnerability that leaders need to be able to display in order to be effective. Can you expound on that a little bit? What is the positivity of that, and what's the downside of that too?
Mm-hmm.
The vulnerability of our leaders.
Yeah, that's a really important a leadership quality to unpack and to really understand, and to understand how to be vulnerable effectively. Because I do a lot of executive leadership coaching, and I see a lot of leaders who at first particularly overcorrect and become too vulnerable in a sense, and their teams are confused and disoriented. So vulnerability is really connected to emotional intelligence. One of the key things for leaders to understand is that the people on your team pick up on your emotions and they will mirror them. And that literally is neurological. That is what is called mirror neurons. And so if you come to a team meeting and you are really anxious and you know that you've got to give your team hard news and that there's going to be a lot of conflict, immediately from before the time that you start speaking, they will pick up on your anxiety and they start feeling anxious. And that limits the ability of our prefrontal cortex to engage in rational problem-solving thinking. And so as a leader, if you're anxious and you show up to a meeting and you need to give hard news, and you can say, I've got to give some hard news today, and I'm aware that I'm feeling nervous and I'm feeling really sad. This is not what I wanted to share today. I am committed to making sure that this is a process in which everyone is heard. I care about all of you. We're going to follow this through, and I'm feeling nervous. When you say that, that's vulnerability. And when you say that, it helps people recognize that your anxiety is actually a whole bunch of emotions, and they can actually understand and connect with those much quicker than if it was just the block of anxiety. So that's an example of how you can be vulnerable and what the potential impact can be on a team. Saying to a team, for example, saying something about this time of year, being vulnerable is really being able to name mindfully and thoughtfully, carefully name what you're thinking and feeling as for the purpose of helping the team or the group move forward towards its goals and its objectives and its mission. So when you're vulnerable, you need to think about, what is the purpose? If I want to say this or share this with my team, what's the purpose? Will it help the group move forward? Now, there is also a lot of reason for a leader to be, again, thoughtfully, carefully, mindfully sharing what they've been thinking, feeling as it relates to any of the work that they're doing. It humanizes a leader. And when you do that, again, I'll keep taking it back to, this is how we build resilience. When we understand who we are, the many different aspects of our being, and what we're coming in with, what we're feeling, what we're experiencing.
I'm going to stay on this line of questioning because Elizabeth King-Jones just weighed in with a question. Do men share their vulnerability and their feelings in the same way that women do?
Men can. Men have been socialized to not share their feelings as much, particularly not in a work environment. So it's much more uncomfortable for men, and it can also be uncomfortable for the folks on their team because they're not used to seeing men express their emotions or be vulnerable. That doesn't mean that men shouldn't. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't be tremendously powerful for men to share their feelings, but it's harder, and men really need and deserve more opportunities to understand what it means to be vulnerable and to practice. As an executive coach, I do a lot of practicing with the folks that I work with, and I have them go through, okay, so you need to show up to your team tomorrow and you need to say this, and you want to be vulnerable because you understand that that will help your team. And so what are you going to say? And then I give them feedback and I say, now practice that again, try that again. How about this? What if someone says that? And they practice it enough to the point where they feel comfortable, where they're not sort of sweating and stiff. And that's a great question, because it leads us to think about the opportunities that leaders have to learn and to grow and to practice and to get feedback on something they're working on.
I don't know, Caroline, if we could let Katie Raunchy in to the conversation. She had a follow-up question, the flip side of men's feelings. Katie, are you there to ask your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if when women are sharing their vulnerabilities and feelings, right, if they're then perceived as being weak.
Yes, Katie, thank you for raising that. And again, yes, because we have all been socialized, men and women, and everyone has been socialized to think that, I mean, the messages that we get about emotions are that it is weak to have emotions. You don't need to have emotions. In the language, even around emotional intelligence, which I draw from and which I respect, a lot of the language that talks about emotions in that field still talks about controlling emotions and managing them as if they are something undesirable. And so children have emotions, and maybe they're allowed to have emotions and to express them in whatever way until they are maybe 7, 8, 9, 10, and then it's time to grow up, which means stop expressing your emotions. So yes, almost any time anyone expresses an emotion, it can be perceived and thought about as, well, that's weak. How can we trust her or him to be able to do what we need to do in our team or in our company? A lot of this has to do with a lack of understanding about what emotions are. And so when we think about doing root cause analysis of a problem, and I will say the problem is the way that we relate to emotions, at the root is a misunderstanding about what emotions are. And part of a great deal of that has to do with how we've been socialized to think about this part of it's connected to how we are also socialized to think about women and women's roles and women's capacities and abilities. And so there's a lot of connectedness to this. I think about emotions as friends who come to visit who have information, and we can listen to them, take their information, and then they leave. There's a difference between having an emotion and the way that we express it. And so an emotion like anger, we can experience anger. Anger can be present. Anger can show up, and we can express it in many, many ways. We don't have to express our anger as aggression. There's a lot of ways to express it. But when we think about emotions as weather patterns, they come, they give us their information. Sometimes they have wisdom if we listen to them, and then they go. And as we start paying attention to our emotions, we will notice that our emotions change, like the weather, perhaps in some places, 12 or 36 times a day. Now I'm excited. Maybe in an hour from now, I'll be anxious. Maybe I'll be angry 20 minutes later. They come and they go much faster when we say, okay, what do you want to tell me? All right, impatience, I see that you're here. Tell me, what is it you're trying to tell me? And then they move on.
Great. I want to take the opportunity to share a personal story that I shared with you. So I let you know that I'm a walker. I've been walking my whole life, year round, regardless of the weather. It came from the fact that I'm from a long line of walkers, grandparents who walk. My dad, who's 95 years old, still walks as he plays golf every day. So it's sort of in my DNA, but I was gone from Chicago a while. And I knew when I came back here that the weather and the winter and days like today are challenging. And it was all about conquering the weather. But then I remembered when I was out in the Pacific Northwest and we would go skiing that, boy, when you get out on the slopes, it's a ski day, no matter if it's 10 degrees out, no matter if it's snowing, no matter if it's sleeting. So it's having those executive level conversations with yourself and not just conquering it, but embracing it and going through that whole executive conversation in your own head, so that then you're bringing people around you along in that conversation. So you and I had talked about that. And I think, is that something you can apply to teams? Is it relevant that you go through that?
So what I hear you saying, Gail, you're talking about one of the 12 habits that I have identified that resilient people engage in, which is what you're talking about is your mindset. And I frame it as the story that you tell. And ultimately, so much of our resilience emerges from the story that we tell. So when we go through a very difficult time in our lives, we could say that almost killed me. I don't know how I made it out alive. That was the worst thing that happened to me. Or we can say that was the worst thing that happened to me and I learned so much. And I made some decisions after that that have profoundly improved my life. So for example, I'll just throw in an anecdote. My mother died from cancer before my 30th birthday. It was horrible. I tended to her in her final months. And it was the worst thing I've ever experienced. And I made decisions immediately about the course of my life based on what I had learned, based on the empathy that I had developed, based on the understanding that I got very deeply about life is not guaranteed. So can we go through hard experiences and be able to tell a story that builds our resilience, that makes us feel stronger than we were before? We have that opportunity right now as we hopefully are coming out of this pandemic to be with our teams, to engage in a reflective process around what was this year like? What were the highs? What were the lows? And what did you learn? And ultimately, what's the story that we want to tell about our company? My company was almost destroyed last year. I had to lay off more than half of the folks on my staff. It was like, for so many people, absolutely devastating, incredible shock. And we've spent a lot of time reflecting on what the experience was like, what we learned, and who we are now. And now one of our mottos is, we are a small and mighty team that can take on anything. Anything. We can take on anything. From now on out, it feels like everything will be like, literally a blizzard in Chicago and I can't make it there to do a presentation. No big deal. So right now we have an opportunity, and as we emerge from the pandemic, to spend some time with our teams crafting the story that we will tell. And we have that opportunity to do that for ourselves as well. What's the story we will tell of having survived a pandemic?
What a great lesson. I want to open up if anybody either wants to put a question in the chat or just wants to jump in. I think we can do that. Okay. Great, then I'm going to keep going. Shalbal Mazandar asked about resiliency in medicine, and it's all about accepting a reality, improvising during difficult times, thinking on your feet, all because there's a higher outcome, meaning, and purpose. Is that something that you need to keep in mind through all these lessons?
Fantastic. I'm so grateful for that to be raised. So as I've mentioned in my book, I have it right next to me because sometimes I forget what's in it, Onward, on emotional resilience. The first habit that builds resilient people that I identify is one that I call know yourself. And resilient people know themselves. And part of what they know is their purpose. And I mean your purpose in life, what are you here to do? What are your big goals? What are you committed to? What will you be unwaveringly moving towards? That is a core part of knowing yourself. And there's a similar parallel for a team or a company in the sense of, what is our mission? Why are we here? What are we, no matter what, committed to? And that's what I repeated to my company all last year. I said, even if we're shrinking, even if how we deliver our work is changing, this is our North Star. This is what we will continue to do no matter what. So great question.
Great. Lynn Hazan has asked, the 12 habits that you mentioned, would you like to lead us through them, and so that we have a good understanding of where you're coming from?
Sure, thank you. So the first habit is know yourself. And the habits are also connected to a disposition, which is basically an attitude or a way of being. So I won't name all the dispositions, but I'll name some of them. So the disposition connected to know yourself is purposefulness. And so resilient people feel deep purposefulness. The second habit is understand emotions, and that's connected to the disposition of acceptance. The third habit is tell empowering stories. The fourth habit is build community. The fifth habit I call be here now, stay focused on the present. The sixth habit is take care of yourself. Seventh is focus on the bright spots, which doesn't mean to negate the challenge and the pain, but it is about focusing on the bright spots. 8 is cultivate compassion, and that's for yourself and others. 9 is be a learner. Anytime we feel like we can identify a learning from a difficult experience, we will be more resilient. 10 is play and create. So the researchers have found that actually creating things, engaging in a creative process of any kind, is one of the most powerful ways to boost your resilience. 11 is what I call ride the waves of change. It's all about how we deal with change. And 12 is celebrate and appreciate. So there's a lot more to say about all of those. And in the follow-up email that you'll receive, I understand there'll be a link to my book and to my website so that you can grab those. I'll actually make sure that it links to a graphic where you can see the 12 habits and dispositions. Lynn, thanks for asking that.
Great, Elena. One last question as we get ready to wrap things up here. We're all working from our homes. We've let everybody in. They get a glimpse of our life around us. The separation between our public lives and our private lives and our work lives. We used to talk about a work-life balance. Those don't seem like two things on different sides of the scale anymore. It's about integrating. Do you think it'll stay that way post-pandemic? Is this a new world we're entering into?
I think so. We're already seeing the signs. I mean, we can see it in my region in San Francisco, where so many companies have permanently left and said, we're always going to be working from home. I used to travel probably half the year. I was flying all over the country. And now I just can't imagine going back to that, because human beings are incredibly adaptive. I mean, it is one of the ways that we have survived. And now why would I fly all the way to Chicago for an hour? And when it actually works okay to come online and do this kind of thing. I think there are advantages, and I think we will go back to being with each other in person, because we are also social creatures and we miss each other's company. Even those of us who are introverted miss being in person with other people. But I think it's been fascinating to see how the private and public persona has perhaps broken down or become a little more porous when we are joining meetings and events from home, and we might have a child or a pet that walks through in the background. I think it's humanized many people in a way that's really powerful. And even if we do go back to being all in person, we will bring that with us.
Great. And that's a great way to end our time today. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Thank you, Elena. It's great talking with you. Thank you all, and stay tuned for more to come.
Thank you.